richest man you've never heard of. Hao Kwa, a Chinese merchant from Canton at the start of the 1800s with millions of dollars in investments. Who is this person and how did he become so rich and just how rich was he? So Hao Kwa was born Wu Bingjian in 1769 in Canton as the third of 4 surviving sons. His family was trying to make a big mercantile business. At the time, the Qing were very wary of foreign trade. Come here, countries. What the bloody heck is this? Why are you so incompetent, you bloody donkeys? You didn't even remember to put China at the frickin' center. Take your bloody pride and piss off. Well, you see, everything made in China was good, and everything not made in China was bad. Because China number 1! So under Emperor Kangxi, they originally opened 4 ports in South China to foreign trade. But when the next Emperor Qianlong came, he became more disgusted at all the foreign peasants arriving at the shores of his empire and closed all but one, Canton. And all the foreign trade was further restricted to a 900 meter by 300 meter island named Shamian Island. On top of that, foreigners were restricted from going elsewhere for more than a few days a month and never without a Chinese interpreter. This system would be affectionately known as the Canton system. And with this system, revenue from tariffs soared throughout the late 1700s, passing 1 million silver taels in 1789. In 1783, Hao Kwa's father would found the Yihe Company, one of what was known as a Kohong, eventually transferring control over to Hao Kwa's older brother, Pui Kwa. As a Kohong, they were the official intermediary between the Qing government and the foreign merchants. Their main tasks from the government was to keep the foreigners in line and collect customs and taxes. As with the early days of the empire, most Chinese merchants of the time were still trading with just Southeast Asia. But the Yihe Company had realized that times have changed and the West ruled the seas. And in conjunction, this was the point that tea blew up as a cash crop. The way the tea trade worked was that the tea farmers would request for advances from the Kohongs, while the British East India Company would require insurance of an adequate supply of tea. The Kohongs acted as the mediator, keeping the entire system afloat. So the tea would be sold in set quantities months in advance of actual supply manifesting. And this system had the side effect of effectively restricting competition to just a few key players. For Pui Kwa, he was willing to sell tea to the East India Company at a slight loss and trade for the unprofitable British woolens to gain a prominent footing in the trade business. This worked, propelling Yihe Company to be the second largest Kohong with an 18% stake in the business dealings with the East India Company by 1798. At the same time, Hao Kwa was making a name for himself as the reputable brother of Pui Kwa, and in 1801, when his brother died, took over the entire business. Hao Kwa shifted his strategy by not willing to take a loss on China's other important export, Nanking cloth, and eventually became the leading expert of business in the eyes of the East India Company. By that time, an oligopoly had formed with the 3 largest Kohongs, Puan Ke Kwa, Mo Kwa, and Hao Kwa. But when both Puan Ke Kwa and Mo Kwa retired and died, it left Hao Kwa at the top. With Hao Kwa at the top, the East India Company wanted to ensure that they had an adequate base of tea supplies and made the strategic decision to get Hao Kwa to groom new junior members. With the goal of slightly creating artificial competition, Hao Kwa was tasked to help these new merchants get on their feet. And at one point, Hao Kwa loaned $100,000 to one of these small merchants. It was not all a loss for Hao Kwa. And when the smaller Kohongs struggled to meet the demands of the East India Company, Hao Kwa would be contracted to fill the gaps. The East India Company was on top of their game, but this was when the discount Brits were beginning to slowly arrive at the shores of Canton. The newly created Americans. Here lies the difference between being a legit and a discount. With the East India Company, there was an understanding that it could not fail and was backed by the Bank of England. So the British pound became a secure way to trade. The Americans had none of that trust system built up and could only trade in physical goods such as American ginseng and silver. This meant that oftentimes with American goods not very popular, they weren't really able to pay for much of the tea. Luck would have it that with the way the East India Company traded for tea, a lot of extra tea would usually be produced, a bit lower quality. And with the tea farmers desperate to sell their excess tea, and the Americans scrambling to just buy tea, the Kohongs would mediate the sales at astronomically low prices. It was then that Howquat had a brilliant but risky idea. He would allocate tea to his American partners for sale globally with the likes of John Perkins Cushing, one of the wealthiest American sea merchants of the time, and then wait for any profits when the ships came back to Canton. Cushing's business evolved to be part of Russell & Co., which became Howquat's biggest partner. The partnership was so big that in 1837, when the British banks Russell & Co. were borrowing from went under, Howquat stepped in to pay the London bank Barings & Co., all in an effort to keep the American trade afloat. With the Americans on the rise, it kind of spelled an in for the British. The nail in the coffin came when the Indian Act of 1833 effectively killed the East India Company as a commercial company, and private British merchants began arriving at Canton in droves. In turn, many of the Kohongs had relied on the stability of the East India Company and thus fell under. Howquat, with his trade empire with the Americans, stayed afloat. Eventually, Howquat became America's sole partner in Canton. At the height of trade, Howquat had over 26 million silver taels in wealth, mostly invested into businesses such as ones in New York. In comparison, the Qing government supposedly only had 7 million taels. It was said, possibly fictitious, that when the 1822 fire happened, Howquat's silver melted into a 2-mile stream. And just as impressively, through the monopoly he created with Russell & Co., he easily invested $500,000 into the US's railroad business. Howquat had achieved his success without resorting to the no-no drug, opium. Others who dealed in the trade would double or even triple their income. 1842, the conclusion of the Opium War and the subsequent unequal treaties would spell the end for the Canton system. Howquat would pass away 1 year later, passing his fortune and legacy down to his son, dubbed by the West as Howquat II. Through Russell & Co., Howquat's descendants likely earned up to $45,000 yearly until the 1890s when the company fell. However, Howquat II was not as forward-looking as his father and turned inward, trying to return Canton to its glory days. He did this by increasing trade with Russell & Co. at a time when people were moving on to trading across the new treaty ports, setting up a multinational empire. And when Russell & Co. fell under, all the wealth eventually trickled out and ran dry. Howquat's legacy has been mostly lost to history. Commissioned and knockoff paintings of the man, which were distributed worldwide during his lifetime, have all been relegated to a footnote. Likewise, a 582-ton ship would be built and named after him in 1844, which would sink to the bottom of the ocean. And the name of his Kohong, Yi would live on as the Chinese name for the British conglomerate Jardine Matheson. By some accounts, this entire system of commerce created by Howquat was a prelude to the modern globalization as a whole.